Hi, welcome to Blogging Heads TV. You're watching Culturally Determined, and I'm your host, Aryeh Cohen-Wade. And my guest tonight is William Bill Black. Bill, could you introduce yourself?
Yeah, Bill Black. I'm a PhD candidate in history at Rice University, currently living in the Memphis area. Writing my dissertation on the Cumberland Presbyterians, who were the largest Protestant church that didn't split along north-south lines during the Civil War era, but I've written about other things, including how watermelons came to have racial meaning, and written about Civil War memory and the lost cause and things like that. So, yeah.
Yes, that's going to be the bulk of our conversation, and that was our original plan. But since we set this episode up, Hurricane Harvey hit the Texas coast, as everyone knows by now. And you lived in Houston for a number of years. You're not there now. But I want to talk about it a little bit. One of the things that I realized when Houston became in the news is that I didn't really have a sense for like what Houston meant in terms of like American culture. Like there's a lot of cities that are much smaller than Houston, which is the fourth largest city in the country, that have much more of a cultural identity. I couldn't have located Houston on a map of Texas before this, and that's probably the fault of my geographical education as a child. But yeah, when I think of Houston, I just thought of like sprawl and the oil and gas industry, and really not much more than that. So, what do you think Houston, represents to the nation?
Well, I mean, what it represents to the nation, I agree with you, though, it doesn't seem to have much of an image in the country other than oil and gas, sort of sprawling Sunbelt city. People think of NASA as well, with the Johnson Space Center there. And even things that Houston has produced, I don't know how many people really associate with Houston. I know several of the members of Arcade Fire grew up there, kind of grew up there and in Montreal. And it's reflected in the suburbs. Beyonce is from Houston. And I think in some of her songs reference it more than others. And I was even trying to find movies that were filmed in Houston or set in Houston. I think part of it is that Texas doesn't really incentivize filming the way that Georgia and Louisiana do. So I found that God's Not Dead, the Christian film, I don't know if you're familiar with it.
I do remember that movie, yeah.
It's set in Houston, but filmed in Baton Rouge, and there's a lot of things like that. Or the sitcom Reba was set in Houston, but filmed in L.A. But the only thing I could find was Rushmore, which I haven't actually seen, is filmed and set in Houston. Wes Anderson's from there. But I mean, what Houston means to me, I think for me, a big thing is just how, it's getting to be kind of cliche in the coverage now, is how diverse it is. It's by far the most diverse place I've lived in. I grew up in Memphis, and I've lived mostly in Tennessee and Kentucky, and so it's quite a shock to come to Houston, where I was looking at some of the numbers. There's 25,000 speakers of Vietnamese in Houston. There's 25,000 speakers of Chinese, 10,000 speakers of Urdu. I think something like 40% of Houstonians are born in another country, or maybe that's 30%, but still quite a large number. I've seen it described as the most diverse city in the U.S. I don't know exactly how they reached that thing, but recently, what you've seen Houston in food writing. Houston's starting to get some traction, and really the best representation I've seen in the city is in a recent episode of Anthony Bourdain's show, Parts Unknown, where he goes to Houston and he goes and watches a Pakistani cricket match in the Houston suburbs and eats some of the various, you have this Viet Cajun cuisine that's emerged in Houston that you don't really have anywhere else. But I guess it's a city that hasn't been as big as it is for as long as Chicago or LA, New York, and I think that's part of why it's yet to really gel into a set of, iconic images. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess that was kind of my next question is why? Is it just that because it didn't start out, it wasn't a major metropolis 100 years ago, and so it doesn't have the kind of cultural identifiers we think about with, cities that are, cities like Boston or Philadelphia that would be smaller, but that have more of a
Longer history.
longer history.
Yeah.
Or do you think? Yeah. So why do you think? Why do you think that is?
Well, I guess I don't think it's unique to Houston. I was trying to think of other cities that would be in a similar position. I think Dallas doesn't have that much and the Dallas-Fort Worth metro area is actually bigger than the Houston metro area. You don't have that much. I think a little more because of the show Dallas, and I think there's a Real Housewives show set in Dallas. I may be wrong about that. But Dallas, Phoenix would be another of these Sunbelt cities. I couldn't tell you much about Phoenix. The only reason I can tell you much about Houston is that I live there.
Right.
I think the exceptions would be Las Vegas, and I think there's a unique set of reasons for that, being close to Hollywood and being this big, casino place. Miami is another one that kind of sprang from nothing in the past 100 years. So I don't think it's unique to Houston, but because it is so big, it makes it that much more surprising. I think it'd be interesting to see if Houston follows, because I think like in the last 10 years, Atlanta has gotten more of an image, what with Outcast and the show Atlanta. Part of that is, as I said earlier, because of what George has done with subsidizing the film industry. But yeah.
Okay, why don't we wish Houston the best, obviously, and why don't we transfer to the topic we originally wanted to talk about, which was these issues related to the Civil War that were brought suddenly back into the public narrative with the protest and the violence in Charlottesville. So I did a previous episode of Blogging Heads with the writer B.D. McClay where we talked about monuments and what had happened in Charlottesville, and that's when you reached out to me that you were interested in coming on. So what's your reaction been to how the narrative has played out over the past couple of weeks in relation to our understanding of the Civil War?
Well, I'd say a couple of things. I mean, by now we've had many, I think, pieces from many historians. There's a lot that's already been said. A couple of things I think aren't being talked about enough. One is how in so many cases what's going on is, how to put it, there's a perception out there that we're having outsiders forcing places to take down their Confederate monuments, when in most cases what we have are cities deciding they want to remove their monuments that are then blocked by state legislatures. That's the case with Charlottesville, Virginia. There's been just a handful of states, Virginia, North Carolina, Alabama, Tennessee, are all states where state legislatures passed laws making it really hard for cities to remove monuments to the Confederacy without state permission. And so it's this weird thing of Republican state legislatures sort of, dumping on local autonomy. Here in Memphis, we have a monument to Nathan Bedford Forrest and one to Jefferson Davis. I think the one to Forrest is, even more controversial. And for a couple of years now, it's actually been an issue for almost 2 decades now. But the city council voted to remove it, and it's being blocked right now by the state legislature, and there's a lot of tension over that. So that's one thing. I guess I don't know if you want to talk about that first before we move on to other.
Yeah, I mean, it is interesting. I mean, there's the hypocrisy angle of the Republicans who supposedly believe in like local control and kind of bigfooting the cities, which are often like the blue dots in the red states that want to remove these memorials. So that is, there's an irony there.
Yeah, I think there's there's an implication that those blue dots aren't legitimate. That's why they don't deserve autonomy. Memphis is a majority black city, and I think there's this fear, a sentiment that you can almost trace back to Reconstruction as far as not trusting majority black communities with being able to govern themselves. So I find that very troubling and very frustrating. Though in Tennessee, both our senators and the governor, all Republican, have now said that they think that those two monuments in Memphis should be removed, which I think is curious. But I think that's kind of more Chamber of Commerce mentality of just wanting to get rid of the controversy, rather than a true commitment to racial justice. But
yeah, so you actually wrote a piece specifically about the Nathan Bedford Forrest monument, which we'll link to below. And why don't you talk about? I mean, there's probably people who don't know who this figure is and what he represents in history. Can you kind of explain who he is and the controversy that you wrote about?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I can. I guess three big things. So he was, in his time, he was the biggest slave trader in Memphis. He became, people thought of him as a self-made millionaire, but of course he became a millionaire in the trade of human flesh. But he was one of the largest slave traders in the country, the largest in Memphis. And then when the war began, he joined the Confederate Army and became a very prominent officer. At the kind of tail end, he was promoted to a general, and he was famed and later celebrated for his kind of more guerrilla tactics. A narrative that's become popular is if only the Confederacy if only Jefferson Davis had recognized what a great tactician they had in Forrest and promoted him and followed that, the more guerrilla tactic of fighting, that perhaps they would have won. Anyway, and probably the most infamous thing he did during the war was at the Battle of Fort Pillow. His troops fired on several hundred Union soldiers who were trying to surrender, in large part because it was an interracial union. I think it was more than one unit there. But anyway, so it was black and white soldiers who were massacred. A couple hundred died. Mm-hmm. And that was arguably I don't think arguably, but the biggest war crime committed on U.S. soil. Well, okay, I get on the continental U.S. How about that? Mm-hmm. And then, of course, after the war, he was active in the early Ku Klux Klan. He was named its Imperial Wizard, which was kind of I think they said Grand Wizard, and it was a title they just kind of made up and gave him because his nickname was the Wizard of the Saddle, and it was just kind of the ceremonial thing. Most of the leaders of the Klan were really more younger men. He was getting older by then. It's unclear how much active role he really played in it, but he was definitely a supporter of it. So those are kind of what you might say are the three strikes against him.
Yeah. So why is there a statue of him in Memphis?
Yeah, well, it was put up there in 1905. He died in 1879, I think. 1905, they put this big monument of him and actually exhumed his body and his wife's from the cemetery where they're buried and moved them to the monument. And I argue by looking at what was going on in Memphis politics at the time and looking at what was said by a lot of the supporters of the monument, the people who were doing the fundraising, that ultimately it was a way of signaling that Memphis was a white man's city, that Tennessee was a white man's state. Tennessee had a kind of a weird thing where even though, like all the southern states, it had done a lot to curtail black voting, it hadn't done as much. So blacks, especially in Memphis, were still a bit of a voting bloc. So you had African Americans voting largely Republican, the party of Lincoln. And you had in East Tennessee, which had been largely Union during the war, there were a lot of them who voted Republican, people like Andrew Johnson. So Tennessee was a bit of, it was kind of a purpling state. It was kind of like how Democrats see Georgia now. Mm-hmm. The Democrats still usually won the presidency, but it was winning by 10 points instead of by like 30 or 40 points like they were in Mississippi and other deep South states. Mm-hmm. And Republican even won the state in a couple of races, like I forget now. I know Warren Harding won it, and I think it doesn't matter now. But anyway, and you had a prominent black middle class. You had this one of the richest men in the city was a black man named Robert Church, who kind of ran Bill Street, ran all the brothels, and created the big nicest park in the city, which was a park for black people. And there's a lot of reason to assert white people's dominance in the city. There's a lot of reason to fear that people were starting to forget that. It was just, I think it was erected the same year that they segregated streetcars in Memphis, for example. And you can look at the piece I wrote I found quotes from the different people who spoke at the ceremony, and making it pretty clear.
Yeah, you must have dug up this cartoon that is in the article.
Yeah. Probably the big smoking gun I found is an article by someone in a Memphis newspaper who, before the statue was unveiled, there was still this big white cloth covering it, and this journalist noted that it looks like he's back on the horse with the hood, and it looks like the Klan's back. And there's a little cartoon that you can see. And I should note that this is a pro-Forrest cartoon. This is, defenders of Forrest now will often try to distance Forrest from the Klan. The people at the time, 1905, totally believed he was, the leader of the Klan, and we're all for that. This was, of course, only 10 years before the Klan, or the second Klan, was formed. So there's definitely some. I think he says that Forrest was calling his own to follow him again. And it's that again that really got me. Well, why is it that Forrest needed his people to follow him again? And that's because white supremacy was still, being undermined in various ways, mm-hmm. and had to be contained.
This is a bit of a side note, but have you ever read the novel Guns of the South?
No, I have not. Is that Harry Turtledove?
Yeah, it is. So I read that coincidentally a couple weeks ago before the Charlottesville stuff. And so it's an science fiction alternative history of the Civil War, in which time travelers from our era who are disgruntled white South Africans travel back to the wilderness campaign during the Civil War, and they give AK-47s to Robert E. Lee. And the new weapons turn the tide of the war. The South win. They capture Washington, D.C. very quickly. The North sues for peace, and the Confederacy wins. And Forrest is a major character in the novel, and it's and so really there's a fictional grunt soldier who is half the narrative, and the other narrative is Robert E. Lee, who is portrayed in a very favorable way, kind of going along with this lost cause mythos. But Bedford Forrest is kind of becomes the political rival for Lee, and Lee runs for the presidency in the 1868 Confederate election against Forrest, who is Lee has a plan for gradual emancipation of the slaves, and Forrest opposes it. And then there's some wackiness where they end up joining forces and fighting it out against the time traveling racists. So it's interesting to see the portrayal of these, these figures live on. But he is, in the novel, he's portrayed, which is actually has a pull quote or a blurb from David Blight on the back of it, saying this is the most realistic Civil War novel I've ever read, which is kind of weird considering it's quasi science fiction. But so Forrest is portrayed as the real racist guy, whereas Lee was just fighting this war because he was such an honorable guy and loved Virginia so much, and wasn't really in favor of slavery, but he just had to defend his beloved home state and was very reluctant to carry out this fight, whereas Bedford Forrest was the ideological firebrand.
Yeah, that's interesting. It makes you think of a couple of things. One is there's a good article about the changing image of Forrest, called "The Contested Image of Nathan Bedford Forrest," and it was in the Journal of Southern History. Unfortunately, it's paywalled unless you have a subscription to JSTOR or something like that. But he makes the case that really it was really around the 1980s that Forrest became really, really popular among Neo-Confederates. There's a weird shift that happens. If you look at in the early 20th century, most of the people that you see doing the work of lost cause memorialization are the United Daughters of the Confederacy, who are still around. And there's this kind of daughterly rhetoric to it. It's, women commemorating their fathers who had served this noble lost cause. And then it's just in the past 30 or so years, I think as the historiography has shifted and there's been more sort of tendency to say, especially after the Civil Rights Movement, to say that the Confederacy was really fighting to keep people enslaved, and trying to debunk all the lost cause myth, that the sons of Confederate veterans became more and more active, and there came to be this more kind of masculine, aggressive edge to the Neo-Confederate movement. And Forrest, if you can, and I think that's reflected in the Turtle Dove novel, that if you think of Lee as kind of a more effete, genteel, julep-sipping kind of person, Forrest is this kind of more Western, rugged image that a group like the Sons of Confederate Veterans would want to claim.
Yeah, this novel was written in the early '90s, I think, and the portrayal of Lee is not even genteel; it's almost like gentle. There's a lot of scenes with him and his wife, who is in a wheelchair, and he, carries her up and down the stairs, and has such a loving relationship, and he loves his horse, Traveler, and it gets a little absurd. One thing have you paid any attention to this controversy about the TV show Confederate?
Yeah, I have. I know, the makers of Game of Thrones recently announced that they're producing a show that's going to be set in an alternative timeline where the Confederacy won, and slavery still exists, at least in some states. And And there was a pretty fierce backlash online. I know during whenever Game of Thrones was on HBO, or like, when the episode was actually showing, people on Twitter would use the hashtag No-Confederate.
Yeah, it's
to
really
keep it trending.
It's a pretty remarkable cultural moment in which people are wanting to boycott something that's just an idea at this point. It doesn't, they haven't. It is basically that the Game of Thrones producers created such a wild success that they could HBO let them do whatever project they wanted to do and would greenlight it immediately. And so they came up with this alternate history thing, and these two guys who are both white enlisted a husband and wife African American producing partners to work with them on the project. And just the announcement of this caused a giant online uproar, and people are saying you shouldn't even, you shouldn't make this at all, which is like a preemptive boycott of a cultural product, which is pretty unusual. I can't think of another instance of it.
It is weird. For me, I mean, I think the fairest critique I saw was from Ta-Nehisi Coates, where he basically makes the case that we kind of live in the country where the Confederacy won. Since Reconstruction was just kind of aborted, and control over civil rights for blacks was sort of ceded to white Southerners, and even the white Southern understanding of the Civil War was kind of co-opted by whites in the North. It's interesting, and I think you can see the long history of these Civil War counterfactuals, and you can see that often there is a kind of lost cause-y tinge to them.
Turtle Dove himself has a series of books that I haven't read, but I know that pursue this idea throughout history of the Confederacy winning, and eventually during the 20th century, they ally with Nazi Germany and, become one of the Axis powers. So this is not like they came up with this idea. It's a pretty well-known,
in fact,
history.
Winston Churchill wrote a story called, let me get it right. Churchill, it's a Lee, pull it up real quick. If Lee had not won the Battle of Gettysburg. And it's a counterfactual story set in a world where Lee won the Battle of Gettysburg. And so this is a person writing what for in his universe is a counterfactual. What if Lee had lost, and what would have happened? And of course you get hints throughout of what happened in, this alternative timeline. And this counterfactual person comes up with a third timeline that's different from what actually happened when Lee lost Gettysburg. And it's been a while since I've read it, but there is you can sort of see, I mean, Churchill does sort of romanticize the Confederacy, and there's an element of him projecting upon American history sort of his feelings about anti-colonialism in India and elsewhere, with kind of African Americans standing in for what he thought of, Indians, and basically implying that things would have gone smoother if white Southerners had just been allowed to do what they were doing and help bring these people into civilization. Anyway, but just last year, 2 years ago, I haven't read it, but there's a novel called Underground Airlines. Are you familiar with that?
Yeah, it's by what is his name? I've read some of his other novels.
Ben Winters.
Okay.
And it's evidence that you can write an alternate history of the Civil War that sort of makes the point of where the kind of point is, look, see how in a way the Confederacy did win, or see how things are eerily similar to this alternative universe where the Confederacy won. Yeah. I think that's kind of the angle that the HBO guys were going to. I really wonder what the reaction would have been if they had just said, said, oh, it's going to be Underground Airlines, and to just kind of go with that source material, but maybe play with it very loosely the way that they did with Man on High Castle. I wonder if the reaction might have been different.
Yeah, there's also a kind of mockumentary called CSA. Have you ever seen that?
Yeah, I have seen that.
Yeah, so that's the same idea, and it's like the Confederacy won, and what would modern life look like if people were still enslaved, and it's very satirical and tongue in cheek. But they show like fake commercials from this world, like being able with a TV commercial for a slave, that kind of thing. So this is not it's not an original idea, and yeah, we have Man in the High Castle, which is what if the Axis powers won in World War II. So it is weird to me that it occasioned this giant backlash. Just the idea of it. I mean, obviously, people care. They care about this a lot, so much so that they are willing to boycott something that doesn't exist yet. I mean, the Game of Thrones guys are known for their unstinting depictions of violence, and particularly sexual violence. And I think
there's some fear it's just going to be kind of slavery porn.
Yeah, so they have kind of torture porn in Game of Thrones, and people don't want to see that, which is understandable. But I kind of, can we like wait until it exists before it's like we go get sent into a tizzy over it? That's kind of my opinion. Like maybe it'll suck. Like most cultural products are crappy, so at least give it a chance. It's not guaranteed to be a disaster. I like Game of Thrones, so give these guys a chance, I guess.
I really think they could have managed the kind of press release better. If I think they tried to do some what do you call it? They tried to do some cleanup with their second appearance with the couple that they're making it with. But yeah, it was hard starting off the way they did, and then sort of talking about the concept of the show as if no one had ever thought of it before.
Right.
And kind of referencing Shelby Foote. That was not wise, since he was such a lost cause influenced writer. I mean, I agree. I totally think a show could be done, but that tells that kind of story and does it in a way that's, not unnecessarily, pornographic and is revealing about our society. But I can understand why certain groups of people, especially Black people, are very nervous about the idea and sort of wishing that, why can't we have a story like of, well, I actually think we are. I think a show's coming out that's going to be like, what if Reconstruction really was successful? Do you know what I'm talking about?
I did see something about that.
I forget now what it's, I think there's like a, I can't remember now. But I think maybe
something where there's a couple states that like became like majority Black states and they formed their own country, or am I mixing something up?
No, I think you're right. Which is kind of a spin on the Republic of New Africa movement of the 60s and 70s, but the 1960s and 70s. Yeah. So, but yeah, I guess that's sort of that's the thing where I can see both sides of it, and not sure how I really come down on it, which is a boring stance to have in this age, but.
Yeah, you're not gonna get clicks that way. Why don't we talk about your piece that you wrote for Vox that was inspired by an offhand comment that Donald Trump made, where he was musing about why was it was one of the rare instances where Trump said something in his stupid way that wasn't itself stupid. He mused, why was there a civil war? He wondered whether Andrew Jackson could have, if he had still been alive or something, could he have like cut a deal And so
Mm-hmm.
you wrote this really interesting piece, which we'll link to, about this question, kind of like the historiography of this question throughout
Whether
time.
the Civil War was inevitable,
Right.
could have been prevented. First, you just made me think. It's kind of funny. I think both Andrew Jackson and Nathan Bedford Forrest are playing similar roles here. These rugged Western men. I say Western as in west of the Appalachians. But these men who could have just through sheer brawn have achieved something, for Forrest it would have been winning the war for the Confederacy, and for Jackson it would have been preventing it. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. But yeah, I mean, he did not know this, but it is an old question as far as whether the war could have been prevented, and for a long time. When historians asked this question, and when they said yes, it could have been prevented, there's kind of two main aspects to it. One was a kind of just kind of old school Marxist idea that the northern and southern economies were not so, how to put it, that that the northern and southern economies were linked enough to where war was not inevitable, and that the only reason war happened was because of kind of irrational actors, people on the fringes. And another part of this was this kind of dismissal of abolitionists, making them out to be the kind of main villains in the story, that they drove the North and South apart with their extremism and just wanting to push the issue too fast and too hard. And so, of course, there's, it's their description of abolitionism and their kind of dismissal of the slavery debate as being really that big of a deal is problematic. They kind of had this assumption, and this is historians writing in the 19-teens, 20s, 30s, 40s. There's this assumption that slavery was going to die out very soon because it was not economically feasible, because it was not modern, and so it wasn't going to last much longer anyway. So having to have a war over it was foolhardy. Mm-hmm. Then, with the World War II, fighting fascism, and later with the Civil Rights Movement, there's this turn of becoming more sympathetic to the abolitionists, coming to see the North and South as indeed having become pretty different societies by 1860. And I think people like James McPherson and Eric Foner, these big, historians who came out of the 60s and 70s, are some of the biggest. This became pretty much consensus by the 80s and 90s. And there's a lot to be said for it, but where I bring in the piece, I bring out this group of historians who've recently kind of been rethinking the question, showing that, well, perhaps the war was not inevitable. Perhaps the North and South were not so different by 1860 that they had to split. Perhaps indeed the economies of the North and South were very entangled, and perhaps the nation could have gone on. But for them, it's an indictment of America. It's saying that America could have gone on for a good while longer with slavery intact. Mm-hmm. So they don't buy that argument that the old generation of the early 20th century had, that slavery was doomed to die out. They say no, slavery was perfectly compatible with capitalism. With modern industrial capitalism. I mean, slaves were working in factories in Virginia and in Alabama and elsewhere, and we shouldn't. Slavery had kind of withstood this big process of capitalization, industrialization in the early 19th century with the cotton gin. It changed a whole lot between 1800 and 1830, 1840, but it adapted, and perhaps it could have adapted. I mean, being careful in academics, they're not going to go and say, how much longer they think it could have lasted. But anyway, it's all you can. I think people often conflate the question of what caused the Civil War and was the war inevitable. And there's a fear that if you say that it wasn't inevitable, that perhaps it could have been prevented, then that means you're saying that that the war wasn't really about slavery. And I think because of what that earlier generation of historians did, it's understandable why it's sometimes hard to separate those questions.
Mm-hmm. So what is the current state of, like, if we can sum up historical, the thought of contemporary historians on, does Trump have a point that the ultimate deal maker, if we had sent Trump back in time, just like those just like in Harry Turtledove, if the ultimate deal maker was sent back in time, could a deal have been made to avert the war? Or
I think most historians are skeptical that it could have been averted once Abraham Lincoln was elected, because his party was dedicated to preventing slavery from extending into Western territories. And the slaveholding South, I think, rightly perceived that was in the end a big threat to slavery. I mean, if you look from so the slave system had thrived so far by being able to extend west, and by that point into East Texas, which was then kind of the next frontier of slaveholding and cotton. So anyway, but perhaps I think there was an article that came out a few years ago in the Journal of American History by a guy named Gary Kornblythe, and he says perhaps if Henry Clay had beat James Polk in 1844, which only would have required a couple of thousand people in New York voting for Clay instead of this third party, the abolitionist Liberty Party. If Clay had been elected, he probably wouldn't have gone to war with Mexico. We probably wouldn't have gotten, those extra territories that were in the Southwest, and people would have been able to kind of keep. And I think that's kind of more accepted. Definitely, I think it's become less and less fashionable to say that the North and the South had become two completely different societies. I think it's pretty hard to deny now how entangled the North and South were, how much the Northern, economy depended on slavery, and I think it's easier to see that now in our globalist economy. It's easier to see those kinds of networks and connections. So no, probably no deal maker could have been convincing enough in 1860, but maybe a little earlier. Who knows?
Mm-hmm. Why don't we close by talking about another piece that you wrote for Vox, with a very arresting headline: "Confessions of a Former Neo-Confederate."
Yeah.
Can you talk about this piece?
Yeah. It's funny because I wrote that piece. What was it? It was. Oh, let me pull it up real quick. I wrote it in. Oh, it's loading. December 2016. Wait, that's not right.
Seems like 7 or 8 years ago at this point, but less than a year. Well, Vox updates. If they have an update, they update the slug line or whatever.
Yeah, so because it was published before the election. It was first published before the election, and so I was writing this kind of in a world where most people were living, thinking that Trump was going to lose. And like many, I was sort of thinking along the lines of, well, okay, Trump's going to lose, but we should, be paying close attention to the things in American society that are being exposed, and not just forget about them, when the era of Hillary begins. And so I was kind of writing with that whole mindset, and thinking about the kind of resurgence, thanks to in part to Trump, of Neo-Confederate rhetoric and imagery, and I'm trying to make the case that Neo-Confederate ideas are a lot more pervasive and powerful than someone might think just looking from the outside. That it's not just limited to, a few people at a Trump rally, or in a Vice, a video, or that a lot of people share this sort of historical narrative, even if for them it's not really necessarily a political ideology. It's just sort of they just believe it's it's what they were taught in school, and they're not aware that it's even necessarily controversial. And so I talk about me being a kid in the suburbs, I didn't really have much of a, my political awakening was in the wake of 9/11 and becoming an anti-Bush, anti-Iraq war, Daily Show watching kind of person. So those are kind of my politics. And I believed that the Civil War wasn't really about slavery, that it was about states' rights and, economic tensions between the industrial North and the agrarian South, and that slavery wasn't, as awful as people sometimes made it out to be. I mean, I would have said something like slavery was inhuman, but not inhumane.
Okay.
I remember telling someone like, if someone has, livestock, they're not going to be beating that livestock all the time, because that, damages your property. And I wasn't fully, I've since learned, I think the separation of families, the emotional trauma of that is really incomprehensible. And also, after reading Edward Baptist's book, The Half Has Never Been Told, you see how this kind of calibrated system of torture and cotton-picking daily quotas. This was dramatized in 12 Years a Slave recently. That indeed, there was a lot of violence at the very heart of slavery. Anyway, so I just talk about why I believe these things, why they made sense to me, and how, as I learned more about American history, how I came to realize that they were silly and wrong. I think, for one thing, I realized that I realized why are we saying that slavery wasn't that bad, and that the South didn't fight to protect slavery. It would seem that we wouldn't have to argue the second thing if the first thing were true. And also another thing that happened was I kind of, my idea of what it meant to be a Southerner grew to the point to where I no longer felt like I needed this kind of lost cause myth to because, I was someone who sort of struggled with my identity as a Southerner because I was in the suburbs, because I was a bookworm and was always hanging out at Barnes and Noble, and there I had a sense that I wasn't truly Southern because I didn't really go hunting or I once went with a friend in a deer shed and sat there for a whole day and didn't see a deer. So I've done that once. But as I've grown older, I've come to see that the South has room for all sorts of people. I think maybe I didn't talk about this, but moving to Houston, living there for a while, also helped me. And I had a moment there. A professor of mine at undergrad just mentioned he was teaching a Southern literature course, and he mentioned that one of the books in the syllabus was Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison. And I had to kind of like double take, not because Invisible Man is set in New York, or mostly set in New York, but because Ralph Ellison was black. I had this, for years, I just had this sort of idea that Southerner meant white and black did not mean Southerner. When I realized that Southernness and whiteness were not synonymous, then that opened myself up to all sorts of ideas of what it could be to be Southern. I mean, we still see this idea that Southernness is inherently white. I'm always careful to say white Southerner when that's what I mean instead of Southerner. We really don't hear enough from Southerners of color, or especially rural ones in the media. But anyway.
Yeah, this gets back to the monuments thing. The people who say that this is just about history and heritage are obscuring, a large subset of the southern population. And
That's the law in Tennessee that's designed to make it really hard for cities to get rid of their Confederate monuments is called the Heritage Protection Act. And I was watching this clip. The Memphis City Council was meeting and debating what they're going to do, whether they're just going to like outright just defy the state law and move them anyway or whatever. And the city council, who was African American, the city council attorney was talking to them, and he just made the comment of about that name, whose heritage are they trying to protect? I think it was Trump who said that they're trying to destroy our heritage, and it's this sort of the unconscious whiteness of that statement of whose heritage do you mean? Because the heritage of Memphis is a lot bigger than just Nathan Bedford Forrest.
Why don't we end it there?
Yeah.
So, Bill, thanks so much for coming on. If people want to find more of your writing, where should they go?
You can go. I have a Twitter account. You can go to @WilliamRBlack. Hopefully, I'm just actually purchased the domain and whatnot, so it ought to be up online soon. WRBlack.com. But so that ought to be up in a day, very soon. And also, if you go to my Twitter, if you go to my pinned tweet, I have a thread of things I've written. Yeah.
Cool. Well, thank you again for coming on and sharing your knowledge of the Civil War, which is more salient. It seems like every day. Thanks to all of the culturally determined viewers and listeners out there. You can subscribe to the show in iTunes, and you can even rate the show in iTunes, which helps other people find it because of the way the iTunes algorithms work. So do that if you so wish, and let us know what you think in the comments, and we'll see you again next time.
Thank you for